It's Wednesday, August 20th, and today is the day where we're expecting to see Hurricane Erin start to make some land impacts to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And that would specifically be in the late afternoon to early evening hours. And we can see here on infrared, it is extremely large, still likely to be around that 500 plus mile wide size like we talked about in last video, and it has also weakened a bit more than expected. It's now down to only a 100-mile-an-hour hurricane, although it's still fairly intense at the center with a pressure of around 900 to 50 to 960 millibars, so that's still pretty intense for a 100-mile-an-hour hurricane, and this is expected to strengthen a little, and that actually does mean something for our people up in North Carolina, because a strengthening storm on impact will feel different than a weakening storm on impact. So definitely be prepared for some tropical storm force impacts, which we're about to talk about in a minute. But the last thing I want to mention is that this storm does still look very organized on satellite. We did see that it was interacting with some shear yesterday, which was hindering quite a bit, but it looks like it's gotten its shape back. And then we see that deep convection at the center once again, which we kind of saw a lack of last night, but it definitely is back, and this storm will likely intensify some more. And the National Hurricane Center agrees that Erin will likely re-intensify to a Category 3 major hurricane as it makes it past North Carolina. And just to put into perspective how large Erin is going to be, they have even issued a tropical storm watch for Bermuda. The distance between Bermuda and the US is extremely large, and for them to even output that is just an example of how large this storm truly is. And then there is, of course, a tropical storm warning for the Outer Banks or just coastal North Carolina. So it's no longer tropical storm impacts are possible, it's that they are expected. So definitely take precautions that you need to take if you're over there. And for actual impacts, the main one is going to be the possibility of seeing some 4-foot storm surge, specifically in the Hatteras region associated with Hurricane Erin. And then second being those tropical storm force winds, likely around that 40 to 45 mile an hour sustained region, which could actually last quite some time because of the sheer size of Erin. And then some gusts potentially in that 50 to 55, 60 mile an hour range with this storm. And it appears that tropical storm winds or tropical storm gust would likely start to appear around 8 p.m. So either the very late afternoon or early evening hours today. And then the last thing is going to be some life-threatening rip currents, which actually isn't just going to affect North Carolina, but the entire Atlantic coast of the US. So really nobody should be in the ocean currently because these are extremely dangerous, and there will also be some 15 to 20 foot waves on top of that right off the shore. That would be mainly focused on the North Carolina coast though, but still definitely something to be wary of if you are planning on going to the beach. And interestingly, the rainfall potential brought by Erin is actually very low, which is something which is definitely more rare for hurricanes. Normally for hurricanes, we're talking about the major risk of flooding inland with the sheer large amounts of rainfall that we are expecting to receive. But actually with this storm, North Carolina has kind of lucked out in this respect because just for the shape and path of Erin, it is not really expecting to see much of any rain. If anything, it would just be some widespread 1 to 2 inches of rain with potentially a couple of isolated spots around 3, specifically in the OBX and Hatteras attic. And we briefly talked about how Erin is expected to transform back into a major hurricane, and the main culprit is going to be this warmer blotch of sea surface temperatures pretty much due east of Florida. And these will really start to get Erin's act back together, and we'll have it be that intensifying storm when it starts to make land impacts. And then the shear in front of Erin, it's not going to be perfect. It's still around 15 knots of bulk shear, but that's still what's considered in that favorable range for intensification. So definitely shear really shouldn't be that big of an issue as it goes up towards North Carolina and starts to make those impacts. And then of course we still have a very moist environment, so the moisture will not hinder this storm in any way. So it looks like it's going to re-intensify a little bit and possibly make some tropical storm impacts. But on the severe weather side of things, this is actually going to be the calmest day severe weather-wise we have seen in a very, very long time. We only have a little blotch of a marginal right up here near the US-Canada border, specifically in northwestern North Dakota and far northeastern Montana. Other areas where I do think we could see some strong storms, although that probability of seeing some severe storms is going to be somewhat low, is going to be in the desert southwest, specifically New Mexico. Then there's also just going to be the potential for a lot of somewhat strong storms pretty much along some low areas, but mostly it's just going to be a remnant boundary, pretty much stretching all the way through the southern plains, Mississippi River Valley southeast, then back up into the northeast. Then, of course, stretching down into the Rockies, we're going to have some troughing activity, possibly bringing some strong storms as well. And then overspreading our entire marginal risk area is going to be the conditional threat of seeing some 60-mile-an-hour damaging winds. And then for hail, it's actually going to be even smaller. And it's really only going to be for the conditional threat of seeing some 1 to 2 inch in diameter hail if you're in far northern North Dakota. And there will also be the conditional threat of some flooding along that area, which I mentioned could see some strong storms today, likely not really seen anywhere above 1 to 2 inches of rain and possibly some isolated areas of 3. And then even more good news is that our heat dome is definitely starting to wane quite a bit. Yesterday, we saw widespread areas of high 100s temperatures, but that has gone down substantially. Now it's really only down here in far eastern Texas and the lower Mississippi River Valley, which are still seeing those mid 100s feels like temperatures. And of course, Florida, southeast, and then even up into the Great Plains is still going to be seeing some of those mid 90s feels like temperatures, but definitely not as bad as nearing that 100s feels like temperatures range. And then here is what the radar could look like on our main risk of severe weather up here in the far northern plains. And we're going to see that it's already very conditional. The HRRR in this front actually has no severe storms in the US, but definitely still the potential as there is going to be some troughing activity through here, then also a bit of a front and low pressure system moving through that could potentially initiate some storms in the late afternoon to even early evening hours, which would bring that conditional threat for some small hail and some damaging winds, but that's looking very conditional. And then, of course, there could potentially be a pretty messy cluster, but still potentially bringing some strong gusts and even potentially severe gusts in the very early morning hours on Thursday as well. And then, of course, we could see some storms along a cold front out here in the mid-Atlantic and southeast. There's actually going to be a bit of a low pressure system complex farther north, which could also bring some strong storms, but these storms aren't really expected to be severe, although there is still the small potential of seeing that if a couple could cluster. So still stay weather aware if you're out here in front of this cold front. And then back into the southern plains and lower Mississippi River Valley, even back into the desert southwest, it's going to be a lot of the same story. Just some storms potentially along a bit of a remnant boundary, which could probably be strong, and that probability of not really being severe is also going to kind of be there as well. And then here are 500 millibar winds showing where that forcing for storms is going to be today. And we really see that the only true shortwave pushing through is going to be up here in the far northern plains. That is why there's the potential for some severe weather there. And also in the desert southwest, we could see some enhanced flow around when that low level jet kicks in around our high pressure system. So also potentially a couple of strong to severe storms out here in the desert southwest as well. And because we have a lot of high pressure systems, one being our heat dome out here in the lower Mississippi River Valley, then another one out in the Four Corners states. Those will also help to bring some organizing shear to a couple of storms as well, which is why there is that very small threat of seeing some severe weather pretty much anywhere from the southern plains, Mississippi River Valley, and all the way back up into the northeast, but it's mostly just going to be some isolated strong thunderstorms. And then here's what the storm environment is going to look like up in our pretty much sole risk of severe weather today up here in the northern plains, bringing that conditional threat for some small hail and some severe gust. And it's actually going to be a pretty conditionally favorable environment. We have quite a bit of Cape nearing 4,000 and a pretty moist environment for that specific region, around a 67 dew point. But our storms would be a bit higher based, which is why that threat for tornadoes is pretty much non-existent, and it would pretty much be entirely a hail and wind threat if storms were to develop. And one of the reasons why we're not so sure that storms will develop is because a bit of a capping inversion out here. We can see that our convective temperature is 101 degrees Fahrenheit. It is not expected to reach 101 degrees Fahrenheit. So that is why storms really aren't currently expected at the moment. But because there is still a conditionally favorable environment, there is that marginal risk of severe weather out here, and that is going to be there because we have a low relative humidity and a very high downdraft cape nearing 1900. So if storms were to develop and get their act together, we could potentially see some big damaging winds, although that's not looking super likely at the moment, and also potentially some pretty decently sized tail. We have quite a bit of cape up here near our freezing level. Our mid-level lapse rates are really high, 9 Celsius decreasing per kilometer, and we have quite a bit of updraft sustaining our bulk shear, which would all paint the picture of potentially seeing some hail. But storms really aren't expected to get going out here in the far northern plains, specifically the US, right over the US Canada border. In Canada, there will be some storms, but this is specifically for the US, and it's not looking super likely at the moment.